The morning sun had barely touched the towers of Buckingham Palace when Thomas Mercer, a third-generation palace guard, stepped onto the cold marble floors of the East Wing. His boots clicked sharply, echoing through the vast corridors, a rhythm that had been the soundtrack of his life since boyhood. Each step felt sacred, a promise he had made years ago to his father and grandfather to protect the royal family at any cost. The air was still, heavy with the faint scent of polished wood, wax, and the lingering aroma of morning tea left in delicate porcelain cups. Thomas adjusted his crisp navy uniform, the brass buttons catching the early light, and ran his gloved fingers over the familiar hilt of his ceremonial sword. Tradition demanded readiness, but instinct told him that today, more than any other, he would need vigilance of a subtler kind. He moved past the grand hall where golden chandeliers reflected in the marble floor, their brilliance dimmed by the soft morning haze filtering through towering windows. Servants were beginning their routines, their footsteps hushed on thick rugs. The whisper of silk skirts and the distant creak of polished wheels from the kitchen staff created a rhythm of life within the palace walls, one that Thomas knew intimately. Yet beneath this normalcy, a tension lingered. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, a stiffness in the posture of the footman, a glance held a fraction too long by a housemaid, a shadow lingering near the doors of the private corridors. Thomas felt it in his bones. The calm was fragile. He passed by the portrait gallery, the eyes of kings and queens long dead seeming to follow him, silent witnesses to centuries of loyalty, betrayal, and whispered secrets. The heavy scent of oil paint mingled with the faint perfume of polished brass fixtures. Thomas paused for a moment before the portrait of Queen Elizabeth II, her gaze steady and commanding, even in painted form. He allowed himself a brief, private thought, a silent promise to uphold the honor of the household, to guard not just the palace, but the people within it. Even as the new monarch, King Charles III, began to assert his authority, and the queen consort, Camilla, made her presence felt with a sharpness that unsettled even the most seasoned staff, Thomas knew that his role required more than obedience. It demanded discernment, courage, and a readiness to confront uncomfortable truths. The morning bell tolled, signaling the start of official duties. Thomas made his way to the private chambers where the day's schedule was posted, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet but precise, measured. The palace was waking, but not yet alive in its usual bustling energy. The corridors that normally hummed with activity were quieter, as if anticipating a storm yet unseen. The servants moved like shadows, their faces carefully composed, their whispers carrying secrets that could topple reputations. Thomas noted each movement with quiet precision. His eyes lingered on the portraits of the royal children, Princess Charlotte, poised and radiant even in early sketches, and Prince George, whose youthful confidence belied the weight of expectation. These were the souls he would protect at all costs. He entered the main hall, where the day's initial briefing would take place. Lieutenant Harper, his commanding officer and mentor, awaited with a grim expression. Harper had been in the service longer than most had lived, and his stern demeanor concealed a heart devoted to the welfare of the family and staff alike. "Mercer," Harper said, his voice low and precise, "keep your senses sharp today. Nothing is as calm as it seems." There was no elaboration, only a warning in the tilt of his head. Thomas nodded, understanding the weight of those words. He had learned long ago that palace politics were subtle but lethal, and that sometimes the greatest danger was invisible, dressed in silk and smiles. The sound of distant laughter drifted from the private gardens, where the young royals played under the careful watch of their governesses. The innocence of their world was a fragile bubble, Thomas thought, one that could burst under the slightest pressure from the adult conflicts swirling around them. He felt a chill despite the sun streaming through the high windows. The palace was a fortress, yes, but even fortresses had vulnerabilities, hidden doors, forgotten passages, and secrets that had lingered long enough to become dangerous. Thomas had seen it before. A misplaced word, a hesitant glance, a loyal servant targeted for reasons beyond comprehension. The thought tightened his chest. In the east corridor, Thomas paused outside the queen consort's chambers. The heavy oak door, polished to a reflective sheen, stood closed, a subtle barrier between ordinary life and the machinations within. He could hear the faint rustle of silk and the soft clink of jewelry. Queen Camilla's presence was always commanding, her movements precise and deliberate. Though polite in public, those close enough to the inner circle knew of her relentless drive to shape the palace according to her vision. Thomas had served long enough to recognize the signs of a brewing confrontation, even when it was masked by civility. A hush of unease seemed to emanate from the very walls. He continued his rounds, checking each corridor, each hall, each doorway. The palace was alive in small ways, the faint murmur of a maid, dusting, the echo of a distant piano, the shuffle of papers in an office. Yet every sound seemed amplified against the silence of the morning. Something unspoken hovered in the air, a tension Thomas could neither ignore nor name. He reached the grand staircase, pausing to glance downward. The shadows stretched long, the sun cutting through stained glass, painting the steps in fractured gold and crimson. A palace this vast had a rhythm of its own, a heartbeat that Thomas could feel in the soles of his boots, and today, that heartbeat felt erratic, anxious, waiting. As he ascended, he caught a glimpse of a figure slipping behind a tapestry in the distant gallery. He squinted, but the figure vanished before he could approach. His pulse quickened, not out of fear, but out of recognition. Something was amiss. Someone was moving where they should not, or perhaps preparing to act where no one should. Thomas pressed a gloved hand to the railing, listening, noting the way the air seemed heavier here, the echo of his own breath unusually loud. He had learned that the palace never revealed its secrets willingly. They demanded vigilance, patience, and courage. Reaching the upper floors, Thomas walked past the rooms of the young royals. The soft giggle of Princess Charlotte filtered from a sunlit nursery. A shadow crossed his mind, a fleeting worry for her safety. He glanced toward Prince George's study. The door closed, the light inside muted. The palace, in all its grandeur and history, felt smaller in moments like this, suffocating in its opulence, yet full of hidden spaces that could conceal both danger and opportunity. Thomas knew he would not falter. He would observe, protect, and act when necessary. As the morning edged toward noon, the palace seemed to hold its breath. Thomas paused outside the private dining chamber, where preparations for the midday gathering were underway. Silver clinked on trays, soft footsteps of the kitchen staff crept across polished floors, and the air smelled faintly of roasted meats and fresh bread. Yet beneath this ordinary scene, Thomas felt the pulse of an approaching storm, a ripple in the calm, a subtle disturbance that had not yet named itself. Somewhere within these walls, a challenge to loyalty, to honor, to the very order of the palace was taking shape. Thomas Mercer straightened his shoulders, squared his jaw, and continued his silent patrol. The palace had secrets, and he intended to see them before they became threats. And as he walked down the long corridor lined with portraits of history, he could not shake the feeling that today, one of those secrets might force him into a choice that would test not just his skill, but his heart. The calm had held for now, but it would not last. The palace remained poised in its deceptive calm as Thomas Mercer completed his rounds, but a faint unease lingered, threading through the air like a whisper that could not be traced to a source. He returned to the gallery corridor, the one lined with ancestral portraits whose painted eyes seemed to follow every movement, and paused. A soft creak echoed from the far end, almost imperceptible, yet Thomas caught it instantly. His hand brushed the hilt of his sword, not for combat, but as a gesture of preparedness, a silent promise to intervene if the palace itself whispered danger. From behind a velvet drapery, a figure emerged, a young aide, delicate and unassuming, carrying a tray of letters bound with crimson ribbons. She moved cautiously, glancing over her shoulder, as if aware of the invisible tension filling the corridor. Her name was Eliza Montford, recently appointed to assist the Queen Consort in managing correspondence. Yet already, Thomas had noticed something quietly admirable about her. She possessed a sharp intuition masked beneath a soft demeanor, a quality Thomas respected more than the brash confidence of the palace's older staff. Today, however, she seemed unusually tense, as though burdened by a weight heavier than her petite frame suggested. Thomas approached silently, his boots muffled by the thick rug, and spoke softly. Miss Montfort, the corridors are quiet this morning. Is everything in order? She started slightly, her eyes widening, then forced a polite smile. Yes, Guard Mercer. Just the usual deliveries and schedules. Everything is proceeding as planned. Yet even as she spoke, her fingers trembled slightly as she adjusted the ribbons on the letters. Thomas nodded, sensing that her words, though calm, carried the tremor of something unspoken. He followed her discreetly down a corridor toward the Queen Consort's private office, noting every shadow and echo. The staff around them moved with careful composure. But the palace had its own way of revealing hidden truths in the smallest of disturbances. A tray was dropped in the kitchens with a clatter that echoed like a gunshot, causing a maid to gasp and the household cat to bolt from a sunlit windowsill. Thomas's eyes flicked toward the sound and then back to Eliza. Something was out of place, and he could feel it as acutely as the polished marble beneath his boots. As they reached the Queen Consort's chamber doors, a muffled voice seeped through the thick oak. It was sharp, commanding, unmistakable. Queen Camilla. Ensure that this matter is resolved immediately. I will not tolerate hesitation or sentimentality. Thomas froze, recognizing the tone that had toppled even the most confident staff in the past. Eliza's hand tightened around the letters, and for the first time, Thomas saw the strain of fear touch her delicate features. The Queen Consort was addressing someone, yet the words carried implications far beyond the immediate moment. He knew instinctively that a staff member, loyal and unsuspecting, was likely the target of this quiet storm. Thomas waited, listening intently. The corridor remained almost impossibly still, the soft flicker of light from the high windows throwing long, uncertain shadows across the floor. A slight movement caught his eye, a fleeting silhouette darting down a side passage, too quick to identify. He strained to see, to anticipate, but the figure had vanished, leaving only the echo of hurried footsteps and the faint scent of expensive perfume lingering in the air. Thomas's gut tightened. This was no ordinary morning. The palace itself seemed to be holding its breath, poised on the brink of upheaval. Eliza, unaware of Thomas's observations, shifted nervously. Guard Mercer, she whispered, her voice trembling. I think something is wrong. The letters, they're instructions, but for someone else, someone loyal. I shouldn't know, but it's concerning. Thomas's jaw tightened. He had learned early in his career that secrets in the palace rarely stayed hidden. Yet the first signs of danger often came to those who noticed the smallest cracks before anyone else. He motioned for her to continue, careful to remain unobtrusive. They're addressed to one of the senior staff, Eliza said quietly, glancing around as if the walls themselves might overhear. I don't know why or what's intended, but it seems punitive, sudden, harsh. The wording, it's unmistakable. Thomas's eyes narrowed. The Queen Consort had many ways of ensuring compliance, but this seemed unusually targeted, an action not merely of correction but of deliberate exile. The thought sent a shiver down his spine. He had always known Camilla could be ruthless, but he had not anticipated the immediacy of such measures being carried out so quietly, so swiftly. They paused at the chamber doors. Thomas's trained eyes caught the slight tilt of the doorknob, the almost imperceptible creak in the hinges, as if the Queen Consort herself had been moving within. Every instinct told him that entering without notice would be dangerous, yet standing idle was no longer an option. The loyal staff member at risk whose identity he could only guess at from the tone and tension in the corridors depended on vigilance, on discretion, and, if necessary, immediate intervention. Eliza swallowed audibly. Should I deliver these letters? She asked, the question barely audible over the echo of their own careful breathing. Thomas shook his head slightly, signaling patience. Not yet. Observe. Learn. Every movement in the palace is deliberate, even those that appear casual. The Queen Consort does not act without reason, and this reason may be dangerous to more than just the intended recipient. He could see her shoulders tense, a flicker of resolve crossing her worried expression. There was courage in her fear. Thomas realized a rare and precious quality in those who walked these halls. As they lingered, another sound entered the corridor, a soft, deliberate footstep that did not belong to any servant Thomas recognized. The faint rhythm carried a weight of authority, and Thomas instinctively pressed back into the shadow of an archway, observing. From around the corner, a figure appeared. Lady Beatrice. Her expression carefully neutral, yet her eyes sharp, calculating. She carried a single envelope, her gloved hand brushing the edges like it contained a living secret. The presence of extended family within these private corridors was unusual, and her involvement suggested that the coming disturbance might extend beyond the ordinary scope of palace politics. Thomas remained silent, muscles coiled like springs. His pulse quickened, not with fear, but with awareness. The palace, so often predictable in its routines, was shifting. Alliances were forming in whispers, loyalties being tested in shadows, and the first moves of a confrontation were already underway. Eliza's quiet observation, combined with his own vigilance, had positioned them at the precipice of knowledge few others possessed. Yet, the question loomed. Would they act in time, or merely witness the unfolding of injustice? The soft murmur of another voice drifted down the corridor this time, the low, clipped tones of the queen consort herself, speaking not to staff, but in a manner that suggested direction and judgment. "He cannot remain!" Camilla's words floated down the passage, heavy with finality. "Arrange for his immediate departure. I will not have disloyalty lingering under my roof." Thomas's jaw tightened. Loyalty, duty, and moral obligation collided in his mind. Whoever was targeted, the queen consort's intent was clear. A loyal member of the household was about to be banished, and the palace itself was poised to bear witness. Eliza trembled, clutching the tray of letters as though it were a lifeline. Thomas placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "Observe, protect. We will see this through," he said, his voice firm but low. The quiet tension in the corridor deepened. Shadows lengthened, and the air felt heavier, as though the walls themselves were bracing for the storm that approached. Every sound, footsteps, the rustle of fabric, the distant chime of a bell seemed magnified, each a harbinger of the drama about to unfold. In that moment, Thomas Mercer understood that the calm of the morning was irrevocably broken. The palace had shifted, imperceptibly yet unmistakably, and he, as ever, would be at the center observing, calculating, and preparing for the moment when action would become inevitable. The first move had been made, the ripple of disturbance had begun, and the palace, with all its grandeur and history, would never feel entirely the same again. The quiet tension that had lingered through the morning finally snapped as Queen Camilla's sharp voice echoed from her chambers, carrying authority that seemed to vibrate through the palace walls. Thomas Mercer, stationed discreetly near the corridor's archway, felt the weight of it immediately. The tone was unmistakable, final, unyielding, and dangerously precise. He had heard it enough times to know that when Camilla spoke like this, no ordinary reprimand was intended. This was a declaration, a prelude to the exile of someone loyal, someone whose fidelity had irked her carefully constructed sense of order. From the shadow of the corridor, Thomas watched as Eliza Montfort pressed the tray of letters tightly to her chest, her knuckles white against the crisp parchment. Her eyes darted nervously toward the queen consort's door. Even from a distance, the tension between loyalty and authority was palpable. Thomas felt a familiar surge of protective instinct. Whoever was targeted by Camilla's orders, they would need intervention, and soon. The palace, vast and imposing as it was, offered few places to hide from her influence. Yet Thomas had learned that loyalty and courage could create shields invisible to even the most calculating eyes. Suddenly, the door to the queen consort's chamber swung open with a controlled flourish. Camilla emerged, adorned in silk and jewels, each movement radiating calculated elegance. Her eyes, sharp and scrutinizing, swept the corridor, landing briefly on Thomas, though she did not acknowledge him directly. She carried an air of certainty, a quiet menace beneath the poised exterior. Behind her, Lady Beatrice lingered, holding the envelope Thomas had noticed earlier. Every detail, the positioning of her hands, the tilt of her head, the measured step spoke of intention. They were not acting in haste. This was premeditated, deliberate. Camilla's gaze shifted to the end of the corridor, where the loyal staff member now emerged hesitantly from the shadows. Thomas's heart tightened. The man, Edward Hargrove, had served the palace for over 2 decades, known for his unwavering devotion, quiet dignity, and the subtle authority earned only through decades of trusted service. His face, usually composed, betrayed the first signs of concern, a flicker of worry that even Thomas had rarely seen. Camilla's words cut through the air, precise and unyielding. Edward, your services are no longer required. You will make arrangements to leave the palace immediately. There will be no delay. Edward's jaw tightened, and for a moment, silence hung between them, oppressive and heavy. The staff and guards who had gathered discreetly nearby exchanged anxious glances, but none dared intervene. Camilla's presence demanded obedience, yet Thomas could see the injustice in every word she spoke. Loyalty was being punished, and morality demanded a response. Edward's quiet dignity stood in stark contrast to Camilla's commanding authority, and the imbalance created a tension that seemed almost physical, pressing against the polished marble floors. Thomas stepped forward slightly, though not fully revealing himself. His mind raced. Duty required discretion, yet morality screamed for action. Could he confront Camilla directly, or would such an act be interpreted as insubordination, risking his career and the safety of those around him? He weighed each possibility with the precision that had defined his career. Camilla's eyes flicked briefly toward him, calculating, but she said nothing. That glance alone confirmed her awareness, her ability to anticipate the moves of even the most cautious guard. Edward spoke, his voice steady but firm, resonating with decades of service and personal pride. Your Majesty, I have served this palace faithfully for over 20 years. I have carried out my duties without fault, without question. If there is a grievance, I request that it be addressed directly, not through abrupt dismissal. The words carried weight, echoing off the corridor walls, and for the first time, a slight hesitation crossed Camilla's expression. She was rarely challenged with such composure, yet her resolve did not waver. You misunderstand, Camilla replied, her tone measured but icy. There is no grievance to debate. Your removal is in the best interest of this household. Delays, sentiment, or appeals will not be entertained. Compliance is expected immediately. Her words were the sound of a gavel striking marble. Thomas felt the ripple of tension surge through the corridor, palpable to every person present. Eliza's grip on the letters tightened. Her face paled. Even Lady Beatrice seemed momentarily unsettled, the envelope in her hands trembling slightly. Thomas could not stand idle. The injustice was too clear, the stakes too high. He stepped fully into the corridor, his boots clicking sharply, the sound slicing through the tense atmosphere. Your Majesty, he began, voice low but firm. Edward has served this household with loyalty and integrity beyond reproach. I urge caution. This dismissal, sudden and without cause, will sow unrest among the staff and cast a shadow over the palace. Camilla's eyes narrowed, and the glint of jewel-encrusted rings caught the light as she crossed her arms. And what would you suggest, Guard Mercer? Camilla asked, her voice deceptively calm, yet the sharpness underneath cut like a blade. That I disregard protocol and indulge sentiment? That I allow disloyalty to linger under my roof? Thomas's pulse quickened. Every word was carefully chosen, every phrase designed to assert dominance and undermine any challenge. He knew that opposing her directly risked confrontation, yet inaction felt like betrayal of principle. Edward stepped closer to Thomas, a silent nod passing between them. There was no need for words. Loyalty, recognized loyalty. Camilla, Edward said, voice steady. This is not a question of sentiment, but of justice. You seek to remove a loyal servant without cause. I request only fairness, an explanation. Is that too much to ask? Camilla's lips pressed into a thin line. Her face, composed, betrayed the first signs of impatience. Thomas noted every twitch, every micro-expression. The palace had become a stage, each movement deliberate, each glance carrying meaning. The queen consort paused, as though weighing her options, before speaking again. I will not justify my decisions to those who presume to question them. This household requires obedience, not debate. You have 24 hours to make your arrangements, Edward. After that, I will take measures to ensure compliance. A murmur of concern rippled through the assembled staff, though no one dared voice it aloud. The weight of authority pressed down like an iron shroud, yet beneath it, Thomas detected a subtle vulnerability, a crack in Camilla's perfect composure. Eliza, unable to contain herself, stepped forward, voice trembling. Your Majesty, may I speak? Camilla's gaze cut to her, sharp and assessing. Speak, she said, curt. Eliza swallowed, her courage drawn from fear and determination alike. Edward has been loyal for decades. Punishing him without reason will not only harm him, but it will fracture the trust of all who serve this household. Please reconsider, if only for the stability of the palace itself. Thomas's heart surged with both pride and anxiety. Her words, though fragile, carried truth that resonated in the silent corridors. Camilla's eyes narrowed, her composure momentarily flickering. The decision is final, she said, yet there was a subtle shift in her tone, an almost imperceptible hesitation. Thomas recognized it immediately, her need for absolute control. Challenged even slightly, left room for maneuver, room for leverage. He knew the moment had come when discretion would no longer suffice. Action, moral courage, and precise timing would be required to protect Edward from an injustice that threatened to ripple through the palace. Thomas took a deep breath, feeling the pulse of the palace around him, the soft whisper of silk, the creak of floorboards, the distant laughter of the young royals, unaware of the storm brewing near their playroom. Loyalty, duty, and morality collided in a single instant. One choice could uphold the honor of decades of service, or one misstep could unleash chaos. He glanced at Edward and Eliza, their faces etched with worry and trust. It was clear. The confrontation was far from over, and the next move would define not just the fate of one man, but the balance of power and loyalty within the palace itself. The corridor seemed to stretch endlessly, shadows deepening, light flickering across the marble floor. Camilla's presence radiated control, but Thomas felt the first stirrings of possibility, a chance to protect the innocent, to challenge injustice, to uphold the legacy of loyalty that had defined his family for generations. The palace held its breath, every whisper of movement a harbinger of the climax that was rapidly approaching. The corridor felt suffocating, heavy with anticipation, as Thomas Mercer stepped closer to Edward Hargrove and Eliza Montford. Queen Camilla's sharp eyes followed his every movement, the subtle flicker of her jeweled rings catching the sunlight and emphasizing the authority that pressed down on them all. Thomas's pulse was steady, controlled, but beneath the surface ran a current of tension that threatened to overwhelm the carefully measured calm he had maintained all morning. Every second counted, every hesitation could allow the injustice Camilla intended to take hold. Your Majesty, Thomas said, his voice unwavering despite the storm brewing in his chest. With respect, this dismissal cannot proceed without examination. Edward has served this household with unwavering loyalty for decades. To remove him abruptly risks not just his livelihood, but the stability of the palace itself. Camilla's lips pressed into a thin line, but for the first time, her composure seemed brittle, the unassailable authority she wielded showing faint cracks under the weight of reasoned challenge. Edward stepped forward, shoulders squared, dignity radiating from his every movement. Guard Mercer speaks the truth, he said. I have served with honor. There has never been reason for punishment. I do not seek to challenge authority, but I will not leave without understanding the cause. His voice echoed, firm and steady, reverberating against the polished marble walls. A hush fell over the corridor. Even the staff, lingering in the shadows, seemed suspended, waiting for the inevitable clash between duty and command. Camilla's eyes narrowed, a storm of emotion hidden behind her perfectly poised exterior. I have given my decision, she said coldly, but Thomas detected the hesitation beneath the words. Her tone was authoritative, but uncertainty shimmered in her posture. She did not expect defiance, yet here it stood before her, composed, reasoned, unyielding. Every guard and servant present felt the tension ripple through the room. The palace, so accustomed to calm obedience, seemed suddenly fragile, as if the very walls held their breath. Thomas took another step forward, hand brushing against the hilt of his ceremonial sword, not as a threat, but as a reminder of his role as protector. Your Majesty, loyalty and service deserve fairness. Dismissing Edward without reason undermines trust throughout this household. You may not realize it, but the staff watches. They observe not only your actions, but their consequences. Justice preserved strengthens authority. Injustice corrodes it. His voice carried weight, honed through decades of experience, tempered with respect and the gravity of responsibility. Camilla's gaze flickered toward Lady Beatrice, whose hand still clutched the envelope with visible tension. The younger royal's subtle discomfort mirrored the unease in the surrounding staff. Camilla's control over the palace had always been methodical, calculated, yet here, in the presence of unwavering moral courage, she faced resistance she had not anticipated. For a fleeting moment, her composure faltered, and Thomas sensed that the balance of power could shift with a single well-timed intervention. Edward's expression softened as he glanced at Thomas and Eliza. "I am grateful for your support," he said quietly, his voice carrying both relief and resolve. "But we must proceed carefully. The Queen Consort is formidable, and any misstep could have consequences beyond this corridor." Thomas nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. He had navigated palace intrigue before, but never with such immediacy, such direct challenge to a figure as influential as Camilla. The stakes had never been higher. Camilla raised her hand, signaling the staff to hold position. Her voice, though steady, betrayed a hint of something unsaid, a calculation, a pause. "Very well," she said at last. "I will consider your words, though I make no promises." The subtle shift in tone was enough. In the palace, hesitation was a doorway, and Thomas had learned to recognize when the moment for action had arrived. His eyes met Edward's. They both understood. This was not an end, but the beginning of a decisive maneuver to preserve justice. With a quiet signal, Thomas guided Edward and Eliza toward a nearby antechamber, out of direct view. The polished marble floor reflected their movements, the faint echo of their steps, a reminder that even small actions in the palace carried weight. "We need to act swiftly," Thomas whispered. "Camilla's patience is fleeting. We must ensure Edward's safety while preserving her dignity. One wrong move, and this could escalate beyond control." Eliza nodded, her fear tempered by determination. "I understand," she said softly. "We'll follow your lead." Inside the antechamber, Thomas observed the staff through a small mirrored panel. Camilla remained near the corridor, her posture composed, yet the tension around her was tangible. Lady Beatrice lingered, fidgeting slightly, aware that the moral tides were shifting. The palace seemed alive with anticipation, every creak of a floorboard, every flutter of fabric, resonating like a drumbeat before a decisive battle. Thomas drew a deep breath, centering himself with a careful orchestration that would soon unfold. He returned to the corridor, stepping into the light with authority, voice calm but unwavering. "Your Majesty," he said, "if Edward must leave, let it be by choice and with dignity. Do not allow fear or haste to tarnish his service. This palace, built on centuries of tradition, depends not only on obedience, but on the wisdom of those who protect it." Camilla's eyes narrowed, but Thomas detected the first signs of concession. The tension in her posture softened, just enough for a fragile equilibrium to emerge. Edward stepped forward, shoulders straight, chin lifted. "I will follow protocol," he said, voice steady. "I do not seek defiance, but fairness. That is all I ask." Camilla's gaze swept the corridor, lingering briefly on Thomas, then Edward, then the assembled staff. Finally, she gave a slight nod, subtle yet definitive. It was a victory small in appearance, monumental in consequence. Justice had not been fully restored, but the first tremors of moral triumph had begun to ripple through the palace. As Edward and Thomas moved back toward the antechamber, Eliza breathed a quiet sigh of relief. "That went better than I expected," she murmured, her shoulders relaxing slightly. Thomas allowed himself a small nod, eyes still scanning the corridor. The palace had not yet returned to calm. The consequences of Camilla's ambition would linger, whispers would carry, and the delicate balance of loyalty and authority remained fragile. Yet, for now, a measure of protection had been secured. Thomas placed a hand briefly on Edward's shoulder. "Stay vigilant," he said softly. "This resolution is temporary. Camilla's ambitions are subtle, and she will observe every reaction. We have bought time, but the palace watches, always watching." Edward nodded, understanding the unspoken weight of those words. Even loyalty, when tested, required constant vigilance. The sun shifted, casting long shadows across the polished floors, the play of light and dark mirroring the precarious equilibrium that had been achieved. The palace exhaled, momentarily still, yet beneath the surface, currents of intrigue and ambition flowed like hidden rivers. Every staff member, every royal, every corridor seemed charged with the potential for revelation, betrayal, or further moral challenge. Thomas knew that this was only the beginning. The palace, grand and historic as it was, had already taken note of the events, and the ripples would spread, unseen but inevitable. From a distant corner, the faint sound of children's laughter drifted, a reminder of innocence within the palace walls, of lives untouched by the schemes of adults. Thomas's gaze softened briefly, settling on the light-filled windows of the nursery. Princess Charlotte's carefree giggles, Prince George's exuberant shouts, reminded him of why loyalty mattered, why courage mattered, and why, in the face of injustice, action was unavoidable. Thomas Mercer straightened, shoulders squared, gaze sharp. The immediate crisis had passed, but the palace, with all its hidden passages and silent observers, was far from calm. Somewhere within its walls, Queen Camilla would plot her next move. Lady Beatrice would carry whispers of the confrontation, and Edward Hargrove, though protected for now, would remain a target for ambition and intrigue. The chessboard had shifted, and the players were only beginning to recognize the stakes. As Thomas and Edward returned to the corridor, a shadow flickered at the far end, a figure watching, silent and unobserved. The palace held its breath once more. The calm had returned, but only as a prelude to the next storm. The echoes of loyalty, courage, and moral challenge lingered in every polished surface, every tapestry, every corridor. One thing was certain: the palace was watching. The drama was far from over, and the next chapter would arrive with the inevitability of history itself.